Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation series. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. I'm Ronald Spatz, Editor-in-Chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, and before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. Alaska Quarterly Review is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional present and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspectives of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. Today, we're featuring poet and writer Jehanne Dubrow. Jehanne is the author of 10 books of poems, including most recently Civilians, Louisiana State Press, 2025, Wild Kingdom, Louisiana State Press, 2021, and 3 books of creative nonfiction, Throughsmoke, an essay, notes, New Rivers Press, 2019, Taste, a Book of Small Bites, Columbia University Press, 2022, and exhibitions, essays on Art and Atrocity, University of New Mexico Press, 2023. Her previous poetry collections are Simple Machines, American Samizdat, Dots and Dashes, The Arranged Marriage, Red Army, Red, Stateside, From the Fever World, and the Hardship Post. She has co-edited 2 anthologies, The Book of Scented Things, 100 Contemporary Poems about Perfume and Still Life, with poem Contemporary Natures Mortes in Verse. A craft book is also on her resume, The Wounded Line, A Guide to Writing Poems of Trauma. And that's forthcoming soon in 2025 in the fall. In addition to Alaska Quarterly Review, Jehanne's poems have appeared in Poetry, Ploughshares, Prairie Schooner, Southern Review, American Life in Poetry, the New York Times Magazine, the Slowdown, the Academy of American Poets, as well as on Poetry Daily and Verse Daily. Recent essays have appeared in the New England Review, Colorado Review, the Common, the Seneca Review, Image, and West Branch. Her many accolades include the Faye D. Castanola Award from the Poetry Society of America, the Adrienne Rich Award for Poetry from Beloit Poetry Journal, an Eric Hoffer Book Award, the Firecracker Award in Prose from CLMP, that's the Council of Literary Magazines and Presses, a Forward Indie Book of the Year Award, an Individual Artist Award from the Maryland State Arts Council, a Southland Foundation Fellowship from the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for the Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Museum Memorial. It is my pleasure to welcome Jehanne Dubrow.
Thanks so much, Ron. I really appreciate that kind welcome. Thank you to Alaska Quarterly Review and to the Anchorage Museum for your hospitality. So I'm going to read a few poems today. I'm going to start by reading a poem that appeared in a recent issue of Alaska Quarterly Review. The title of the poem is Hineni, which in Hebrew means here I am. Hineni. In the painting by Chagall, figures move diffusely through the scene as in the way of light through glass. Red is the father, a yellow burning is the boy laid on a fog of fire. So many questions here. Why Isaac winks at us, why two angels hover like a mist of white and blue. In the brown distance, someone is carrying a cross, someone running from the ghetto of a later time, the old world turned to blazing. What I like about Chagall is that he sketches the biblical beside the daily news. In my tradition, we call this story the binding, not perhaps because Isaac is bound to an altar pinned by his father's daggered faith. No, we're tied by the ligature of history, the purple wound it leaves. Here I am, says Abraham, when he's summoned to kill his own son. Here I am, the cantor sings, on certain days in synagogue, and the room stills with all that it means to ask for mercy from a great, unflinching power. Here I am, I might say to the oily darkness at the edge of this frame, these modern years, when what we are is hated. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Chagall's painting, a mother reaches out to stop what can't be stopped. Her hands tear at the green shimmering of air. So I'm going to read today a few poems from my next book of poems, Civilians, which comes out any moment now from LSU Press. And Civilians is the final book in what I call my military spouse trilogy. For 20 years, my husband was a career officer in the U.S. Navy. And the first book that explored this experience of being married to the military was called Stateside. It came out in 2010. And when I finished that book, I thought that I was done with the topic, but it turned out that I wasn't. So this is a sonnet from Stateside, and it's called Against War Movies. I see my husband shooting in Platoon, and there he is again in MASH. How weird to hear him talk like Hawkeye Pierce. And soon I spot him everywhere, his body smeared with mud, his face bloodied. He's now the star of every ship blockade and battle scene, the Fighting 69th, A Bridge Too Far, Three Kings, Das Boot, and Stalag 17. In Stalingrad he's killed, and then he's killed in Midway and a few good men. He's burned or gassed, he's shot between the eyes, or shoots himself when he comes home again. Each movie is a training exercise, a scenario for how my husband dies. So after Stateside came out in 2010, I read at civilian and military institutions around the country, and I began to think about how I belonged to two very different communities. I was a member of the military community, and I was also an academic. And I kept thinking, based on these experiences of reading in all these different places, that these two communities spoke profoundly different languages and that they weren't speaking to one another. And what a terrible loss that was, that the military wasn't speaking to academia and academia wasn't speaking to the military. And that's how I came to write the sequel to Stateside, which was called Dots and Dashes. And this is another sonnet, and it's from Dots and Dashes. From the Pentagon. He brings me chocolate from the Pentagon. Dark chocolates shaped like tanks and fighter jets, milk chocolate tomahawks, a bonbon like a Kirsch grenade, mint chocolate bayonets. He brings me chocolate ships, a submarine descending in a chocolate sea, a drone unmanned and filled with hazelnut praline. He brings me cocoa powder, like chocolate blown to bits, or chocolate squares of pepper heat. Or if perhaps we fought, he brings a box of truffles home, missiles of semi-sweet dissolving on the tongue. He brings me Glocks and chocolate mines, a tiny transport plane, a bomb that looks delicious in its cellophane. And that poem is based on a true story. There really used to be on the ground floor of the Pentagon a beautiful chocolate shop that did sell things like chocolate tanks and chocolate fighter jets. So after Dots and Dashes came out, I really thought I was done with the subject of writing about being part of a military marriage. And then several years ago, my husband finally retired from a career in the military. And I realized that I still had a little bit more to say. And what I needed to talk about was what it's like to return to civilian life, what it means to give up the life of uniformity and uniforms, and what it meant for me to cease to be my own label, which was as a dependent, and what it would mean for the two of us to become equally civilian and equally uncertain about what lay ahead. So this is the opening poem in Civilians. It's called, "What Do You Give the War That Has Everything?" The first year, we were told, is always the most difficult, a neutral zone of afternoons and nights. "Dear war," we said, "we are sending ourselves folded inside gilded envelopes. We have stamped your name in wax." By the second year, we'd learn to rip the bed sheets into strips for bandages. "This is the gift of cotton," we said, "that it soaks whatever seeps." Soon there was leather, soon there was linen, the wood we burned when supplies were cut to the front. And later there was iron melted red and molded into spears, the fruit shape of grenades. In the seventh year, we gave the war a heavy blanket made of wool. "Never mind," we said, "the smell of other bodies in the folds." We forgot the year of bronze. Year 9, we offered up the decorative, a piece of pottery painted with a chariot, the dead king dragging through the dirt. The war broke our present into shards. After that were years of tin and steel, the tear of silk, like a flag the horses trample on, then lace, as with the tender bodice of a girl. In the 14th year, there was ivory, because why not pull down the giants of the world? And next, a crystal cup for drinking victory, a porcelain plate to serve a traitor's head. In year 25, we engraved the war on silver. "This is costing us too much," we said. We barely counted then the years of pearl and coral, the ruby like a puncture wound, the poison blue of sapphire set in gold. The war took anything we had to give. Decades on, we gave emeralds for the green of some forgotten field. We gave the war a diamond to honor its cleave and glittering, its dreadful way of capturing the light. And that poem is, of course, inspired by the idea of those anniversary gifts that you give every year on a wedding anniversary. There are a number of poems in Civilians that simply have the title Civilian, and most of them circle around efforts to attempt to define what a civilian is. So this is the first civilian poem in the book, and it's a villanelle. Civilian. I bring the war into my bed each night and let it press metallic to my cheek. I barely move beneath the trembling light that it emits, a semaphore both bright and shadowy, its messages oblique. I bring a war into my bed. Each night it floats across the sheets toward me, despite the little swells of fear I never speak. I barely move beneath the trembling light, the bite of sea salt on my lips, the slight unnerving sound of waves, the anchor's creak. I bring his war into my bed each night, anticipate its sonar ping, invite its touch. I know the heat its missiles seek. I barely move. Beneath the trembling light, I am the target in the line of sight. I am a shore toward which the cruisers streak. I bring our war into my bed each night and barely move beneath its trembling light. And here's a little poem that sums up the whole history of war. It's called Epic War Poem. What else but a soldier raising by his shield? What else but the dutiful? What else but a battle muraled on a wall and Troy a piece of artifice to gaze upon? What else but the voice, a garment shredded in its grief? What else but ash? What else but men on wooden ships for centuries? Their keening is an arrow to the throat. What else but kings? What else but the trebuchet of years? What else but sawbuck fences leaning near a field? What else but America? What else but daguerreotypes, a line of corpses posed within the frame? What else but the guns? What else but the trenches stuck with mud? What else but modernity and the long parade of after? What else but cinders mixed with milk while the scorched are drifting, processed into smoke? What else but the skirmishes of scholars, language too little and too much? What else but brief eras of indifference when the dead are left alone? What else but the forged and hammered thing of poetry, all the failures of our making? What else but the litany of bombs? So whenever I'm stuck writing poems, I always like to write a poem that engages with a work of art, an ekphrastic poem, because it takes me out of myself. So this poem is inspired by a beautiful oil painting from 1865, painted by Winslow Homer, and it's called Veteran in a New Field. Already he has worked like this for hours, moving his scythe beneath the gold horizon. There's stillness here. There is the swirl of wheat, both what's been cut and what remains standing, and the blade not so different from a bayonet, a useful edge that's made of steel, although it's best to forget everything except the green and yellow glimmering brushstrokes of orange deeper in the field. What little speckling of red there is at the root. Mostly there's sky, a shade of blue that might be called his child's eyes, or the blue of a broken shell he once found tumbled from a nest. There's the sweat that leaves a shadow on his shirt and his uniform coat thrown far to the corner of the frame and the shape of his old canteen. Later, he will lift the dark metal to his mouth and drink until he barely tastes the dust. He'll keep his gaze directed at the dirt behind him, the labors of the day laid flat, and the grain giving way before him, falling no heavier than light across the ground. For all three of these military spouse books, I've written sonnets that engage with small artifacts of war, little objects that contain powerful stories about the battlefield and about the history of combat. So this sonnet is inspired by the whistles that were blown in World War I to signal that men should leave the trenches and run out into no man's land. This is called Trench Whistle. I call my dogs with it, a blast of sound that summons them from far across the grass, and they come running at the trill, each hound a blur of lead-gray fur, a yipping mass. They only know the pleasures of the lawn, the clovered fragrances. The cry I make is like a strident bird that's quickly gone, the branch now bare, the air that seems to shake with what was there before. They can't conceive this whistle mobilized whole companies of men. Its voice was sharp enough to cleave the clamor of the front, the batteries of mortar rounds. I call, and each dog runs, unhunted by the terror of the guns. And throughout these three books, I've often engaged with classical examples of war literature, especially looking to the ancient Greeks, to Homer in particular, to the Iliad and to the Odyssey. And so this next poem looks at a moment in the Iliad when Andromache learns that her husband Hector has been murdered quite terribly by Achilles. And the title of the poem is for a kind of color, a purple that came to signify royalty and it was derived by dyeing mollusks or by leaching the dye from mollusk shells. It's called Tyrian purple. Please understand, to heave Hector through the dirt, Achilles must first cut holes in his enemy's heels. Hector, threaded like a needle with leather cord and tied to a chariot that will pull him around the walls. Imagine a body strong enough to be strung like this. Imagine such stitching is an art, and we call it battle. Andromache, deep in the palace, is weaving a cloak on a wide loom, wool like the amethyst shadows beneath her eyes, that vivid sleeplessness. She's tacking flowers to the fabric when she hears the weeping everywhere in Troy. The bobbin unspools from her fingers because the warp is a place of order and death the cutting shears. Who can blame Andromache if she sits at the loom for hours, rectangular world where nothing extends beyond the cloth's perimeter? At this point in the war, everyone has lost the thread of narrative, any reason beyond armor and the carrion birds with their beaks like sharpened secateurs. Who wouldn't want to take up some craft, pottery perhaps, or painted scenes on funerary stones? Don't hands need occupation when the city is besieged? Probably a reader believes it frivolous. These fibers dyed the plum of galaxies, all that great oppressive sky, and the murdered looking down from their fixed constellations. Even a wife must find a pastime. It's late in our history to condemn the way people spin out a war, if they twist the days like fibers on a spindle. Imperial purple, purple of bruised loyalties, unfadable purple that stains the maker's skin. So it's always been a challenge sending out these military spouse poems. In some cases, I've been accused simply by virtue of being married to a career military officer of being complicit with America's wars. And so I wanted to try to write a poem in which I explained myself and my work and sort of emphasize that ultimately I think I'm writing about marriage and the intimacy of marriage and the fact that we often feel like there's a part of our spouse that remains unknowable and unreachable, no matter what they do. I think that feeling is heightened when you're married to somebody whose job is to serve war. But I believe that that feeling is palpable in any marriage or in any very long-term relationship. So this poem is called Domestic Policy. Today, I didn't say divorce because I was sickened by the news from Afghanistan. Translators and their families left waiting at the gates, while American personnel lifted off in the wide indifference of their transport planes. I said divorce because I hadn't made space in the cabinet for my husband's things, and he was angry I did not leave a vacancy for what he carried home from war. I was tired of him stacking bowls on the top rack of the dishwasher, a policy I can't abide when the lower rack is an open country waiting to be washed clean. Forgive me, reader, for the weakness of my marriage. I didn't say divorce because my husband would rather a drone hover above a wedding procession, the party far below, embroidered dresses glinting, small mirrors sewn into the hems. He prefers a pilot fire from a distant, unendangered screen. And I believe killing should come with the risk of dying for the killers. But that's not why I said divorce. Forgive me, reader, for the poems of closets and kitchens. Marriage is not two ideologies fighting at a table while the soup goes cold on a spoon. Marriage is two people shouting about spices, the ordering of jars by alphabet or continent, as if everything depends on an ounce of turmeric fading under glass. Perhaps I said divorce for all the wrong reasons. Forgive me for scrubbing the pot with a bristled brush. My fury at the gold-stained enamel is almost the same size as my rage that somewhere a helicopter strikes on civilians in the dark. Forgive my sentiment. All I can do is keep scraping the dried burning from the pan. And that's kind of how I think of my poems, that they're scraping the dried burning from a pan. So I'm going to close with the two final poems in Civilians. The first is a love poem, and the second is a kind of letting go poem. This is called Pledge. Now we are here at home in the little nation of our marriage, swearing allegiance to the table we set for lunch or the wind chime on the porch, its easy dissonance. Even in our shared country, the afternoon allots its golden lines so that we're seated both in shadow on opposite ends of a couch and two gray dogs between us. There are acres of opinions in this house. I make 2 cups of tea, 2 bowls of soup, divide an apple equally. If I were a patriot, I would call the blanket we spread across our bed the only flag. Some nights we've burned it with our anger at each other. Some nights we've welcomed the weight, a woolen scratch on both our skins. My love, I am pledging to this republic for however long we stand. I'll watch with you the rain's arrival in our yard. We'll lift our faces together toward the glistening. And this final poem is another one of the Civilians poems in the book, Civilian. These days, I'm mostly grateful he's one of us, no longer a piece of metal stamped with his name, identifying facts. He no longer jangles the click of steel to steel, no more in service to a ship or the gray machinery of a state. Now, when we touch, I can feel his edge worn down and barely miss the keenness of his mouth. I remember, for decades, he wore 2 tags around his neck, one to leave with the body, the other, perhaps, brought back to my hands. Thank you so much.